The grand assembly hall of the space station, called Harmony's Promise, stretched out like a massive dome of crystal and steel. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy filled the seats in careful arrangements that kept old enemies separated by neutral zones and diplomatic protocol, while Ambassador Triker of the Krell Empire watched the entrance with 4 of his eyes while the other 2 scanned the room for threats. His security detail stood behind him, 12 warriors bred for combat from the moment they hatched from their eggs. Each one stood over 3 meters tall, with armored plates covering their bodies like natural shields, carrying weapons that could tear through reinforced hull plating, and yet Triker still felt uneasy, because this peace summit had already seen 2 assassination attempts in the first 3 days, and everyone knew more would come. The war between the Krell Empire and the Vaxian Collective had raged for 5 brutal years. Millions had died on both sides. Whole planets had been reduced to ash and radiation, and the economic damage threatened to destabilize the entire sector, which was why the Galactic Council had finally forced both sides to this neutral station to negotiate an end before the conflict consumed everything. Kor heard the murmur before he saw them. The human delegation had arrived late again. He turned to watch as 3 figures entered through the main doors, and the entire mood of the room shifted in subtle ways that most species would miss, but a Krell warrior always noticed. Ambassador Chun walked at the front. She was a small woman by human standards, wearing a simple black suit that looked plain compared to the elaborate robes and armor worn by other delegates, but there was something in the way she moved that made even the Krell warriors pause and take notice. A confidence that suggested she feared nothing in this room, despite being surrounded by beings who could crush her with barely any effort. Behind her came a young man carrying datapads and looking nervous, clearly an assistant or aide who posed no threat to anyone. But it was the third figure that made Trikar's mandibles click together in confusion. The security officer was a human female who appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s by their species standards. She wore a plain gray uniform with no medals or decorations visible, carried no weapons that Trikar could see with any of his eyes, and moved with an easy, relaxed gait that suggested she had no concerns about the room full of armed soldiers and bodyguards surrounding the various delegations. "Is that really all they brought?" his chief of security asked in the clicking language of the Krell people. One guard, and a female at that, for their ambassador during the most dangerous peace summit in a generation. Trikar watched the human delegation take their assigned seats near the center of the hall, where Ambassador Chun would have had access to the speaking floor. The young male assistant immediately began organizing datapads and documents, while Ambassador Chun reviewed something on a handheld device. And the security officer did something that made every warrior in the room pause in disbelief. She walked to a corner position, about 5 meters from Ambassador Chun. She looked around the room once with eyes that seemed to catalog everything and everyone in a single sweep. And then she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, closed her eyes, and within minutes appeared to be sleeping. "By the ancestors," Trikar's security chief muttered. "The human is sleeping. Their only guard is sleeping during active negotiations." Laughter rippled through the Krell delegation, quiet enough to maintain diplomatic courtesy, but loud enough that the humans surely heard it. Across the room, Trikar could see the Vaxian guards shimmer with barely contained psionic energy as they exchanged confused glances, their crystalline forms refracting light in patterns that indicated bewilderment. The Talaxian delegation's security team, massive beings of muscle and cybernetic enhancements, stared at the sleeping human with what might have been pity. The Shrell representatives faded in and out of phase as they observed, their ghostly forms flickering with what Trikar recognized as amusement. Ambassador Chen seemed completely unconcerned. She stood when her turn came to address the assembly and spoke with calm authority about the human coalition's position on territorial disputes and reparations. Her voice never wavered. Her posture never suggested any worry about the fact that her only protection was currently unconscious in the corner. During a break in proceedings, Tricor approached the human delegation. Diplomatic protocol required it since this was their first face-to-face meeting. Ambassador Chung greeted him with a slight bow that showed respect without submission. "Ambassador," Tricor said carefully in the common trade language, "I hope you find our station's accommodations acceptable." "Very much so, Ambassador Tricor," Chung replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your people have been excellent hosts despite the difficult circumstances." Tricor gestured with two of his arms toward the corner where Captain Reeves, he had learned her name from the delegation roster, still sat with her eyes closed. "I must confess curiosity about your security arrangements. Is it customary for human guards to sleep while on duty?" Ambassador Chun's smile grew slightly wider and somehow more dangerous. "Captain Reeves is exactly where she needs to be, doing exactly what she needs to do, Ambassador. But she is asleep," Tricor pressed. "Surely you understand that 2 delegations have already suffered casualties from assassination attempts. Does your government not consider your safety important enough to send adequate protection?" "Oh, I have adequate protection," Chun said softly. "More than adequate, I assure you." Before Tricor could respond, the session bell chimed. Delegates returned to their seats and negotiations resumed. Tricor watched Ambassador Chun return to her position with that same unworried confidence, while behind her the sleeping guard did not move or wake or show any sign of awareness. As the day wore on, Tricor found his attention drifting back to that corner again and again. Captain Reeves never moved except for the slow rise and fall of her chest, indicating she was breathing. She didn't shift position, didn't open her eyes, didn't react when a Vaxian delegate's angry shouting made half the room flinch. The humans conducted their negotiations with perfect calm. Ambassador Chun spoke eloquently about ceasefire terms and demilitarized zones, while her assistant provided data and documentation with efficient precision, and their guards slept through it all, like she was in her own quarters instead of a room containing dozens of species who had spent years perfecting the art of killing each other. When the session finally ended after 8 hours of debate and argument, Tricor watched the various delegations file out. Security details moved in tight formations around their charges, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats in every shadow. And then he noticed Captain Reeves had opened her eyes. She stood up in one smooth motion that suggested her muscles hadn't stiffened at all from sitting motionless for hours. She stretched her arms above her head with a casual ease that made the gesture look almost lazy, rolled her shoulders once, and then simply walked after Ambassador Chun and the assistant as they headed for the exits. Several security chiefs from other delegations watched her go. Tricor saw them making notes on their datapads and recognized the gesture. They were reporting back to their intelligence services, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. "Sir," his chief of security said quietly, "should we investigate human security protocols?" Tricor clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "Yes, but carefully. There is something about that sleeping guard that troubles me." "She was just sleeping, sir," the security chief said with confidence. "Humans are soft mammals. They require regular rest cycles, unlike proper warriors." But Tricor kept thinking about Ambassador Chun's smile when he had questioned her about Captain Reeves. There had been something in that expression, something that suggested the human ambassador knew a joke that no one else understood yet, and Tricor had not survived 3 wars and risen to ambassador rank by ignoring his instincts when they warned him that appearances might be deceiving. Shrek's crystalline form refracted the soft blue light of her workstation, into rainbow patterns across the walls of her small intelligence office. As a Vaxian, she processed information through quantum resonance patterns that most species couldn't even perceive, which made her excellent at finding connections that others missed. And right now, every pattern she found about the humans made her increasingly concerned. 7 days had passed since the Peace Summit began. 7 days of watching Captain Reeves take her position in that corner. Sit down, close her eyes, and apparently sleep through. Hours of tense negotiations while her ambassador conducted diplomatic business without any visible concern for security, and 7 days of Shrek becoming more convinced that something was very wrong with this picture. She had started her investigation casually, just routine background checks on all the security personnel from major delegations because that was her job as an intelligence analyst. But the moment she pulled up human military records, her casual interest transformed into professional. Alarm humans had only joined the Galactic community 43 years ago. They were newcomers compared to species like the Krell, who had been traveling between stars for millennia, or the Vaxians, who had built quantum computers before humans had discovered fire. And yet in that short time, humans had earned a reputation that made even elder species nervous. The data files painted a picture that seemed contradictory at first. Humans were described as creative and cooperative, skilled at diplomacy and trade, enthusiastic about cultural exchange and scientific collaboration, but buried in the military intelligence reports were words and phrases that made Shrek's energy matrix fluctuate with something close to fear, persistence, predator evolution. One xenobiology report stated, humans are one of only 3 known species that evolved by chasing prey over extremely long distances until the target collapsed from exhaustion. Unlike the other 2 species who lost this trait after achieving civilization, humans retain both the physical capacity and psychological drive for persistence. Hunting. Shrek had pulled up videos from Earth showing human endurance athletes. She watched in growing horror as humans ran for hours without stopping, their bodies managing heat and energy in ways that would kill most species. And the comments on these videos from other humans suggested this wasn't even considered exceptional, just something that people did for recreation. Another file detailed human warfare throughout their history. Shrek read accounts of conflicts that made the current Krell-Vaxian war seem almost civilized by comparison. Total wars where entire populations had been mobilized, guerrilla campaigns that lasted decades, sieges where defenders had eaten their own dead rather than surrender the Vaxian. Collective fought wars over territory and resources with clear objectives and rules of engagement. When defeated, they surrendered and negotiated terms because continuing to fight after defeat was illogical. But humans apparently had entire military doctrines built around the concept of refusing to surrender even when victory was impossible. Last stand, fighting to the death. No retreat, no surrender. These phrases appeared again and again in human military history. They had awards and medals specifically for soldiers who had died rather than withdraw. Songs and stories celebrating defeats where humans had inflicted maximum damage before being wiped out. Shrek found herself reading about something called the Alamo, where fewer than 200 humans had held a fortification against thousands of enemies for 13 days. They had all died, but apparently this was considered a glorious moment in human history because they had refused to give up. And then she found similar stories from dozens of different human cultures. Spanning thousands of years, the pattern was clear and terrifying. Humans measured military success not by survival, but by how much damage they inflicted before falling. Not by winning, but by how long they refused to lose. This was fundamentally different from how every other species approached warfare. Then Shrek found Captain Sarah Reeves's service record and her energy matrix nearly destabilized from shock. Reeves wasn't just a soldier. She was part of something called the Scout Corps, an elite unit that specialized in what humans termed asymmetric warfare. As Shrek read through the operational summaries, she realized this was a polite way of saying nightmare fuel for enemy forces. The captain had been deployed to 47 different conflict zones in her 12-year career. She had operated behind enemy lines for extended periods, sometimes months at a time, surviving on minimal supplies while conducting sabotage and reconnaissance. And her mission success rate was 94%, but it was the details that made Shrek's form pulse with alarm. Reeves had 43 confirmed kills in direct combat situations, had extracted high-value targets from installations that were supposed to be impenetrable, had once walked 70 kilometers through hostile territory while wounded to reach an extraction point, and her psychological evaluation contained a phrase that Shrek had to read 3 times to believe. Subject displays controlled hypervigilance, consistent with enhanced threat assessment protocols. Even during mandatory rest periods, neurological scans indicate heightened environmental awareness. Subject describes this state as tactical rest, where she maintains threat monitoring while achieving necessary physiological recovery. Shrek pulled up more data about human neurology. What she found explained why Captain Reeves could sit motionless for hours, yet somehow still be considered on duty by human military standards. Human brains process threats through something called the amygdala that never fully shut down even during sleep, constantly monitoring for danger at a subconscious level. Most species had similar threat response systems, but they deactivated during rest cycles. The Vaxian consciousness completely suspended during regeneration periods. The Krell entered a deep torpor where they were basically unconscious, but humans had evolved as both predator and prey, hunted by larger carnivores while simultaneously hunting game, which meant their threat detection systems had to stay active even when they appeared vulnerable. Captain Reeves had trained this natural ability to an extreme level. According to her evaluation, she could track multiple targets simultaneously while in tactical rest, identify threats by sound and smell as well as sight, and transition from rest to combat readiness in under 2 seconds. And suddenly Shrek understood with chilling clarity that the human wasn't sleeping in that corner. She was hunting every delegate who walked through that assembly hall, every security guard who stood at their post, every aide and assistant and translator. Captain Reeves was cataloging all of them, assessing threat levels, planning response scenarios, maintaining a constant tactical awareness, while appearing completely unconscious and vulnerable. The apparent weakness was deliberate. Anyone who wanted to attack Ambassador Chun would see one sleeping guard and assume the humans were unprepared, would plan their assault based on the assumption that they only had to overcome a single distracted sentry, and they would walk straight into a trap because the deadliest thing in that room was the one they had dismissed as no threat at all. Shrek pulled up more intelligence on human military philosophy. She found a phrase that appeared repeatedly in their strategic documents. Appear weak when you are strong. Appear strong when you are weak. Humans had built their entire approach to conflict around deception and misdirection, making enemies underestimate them until it was too late. She found records of the Cronus incident. Every intelligence analyst in the galaxy knew about humanity's first major interstellar conflict, but Shrek had never read the complete files until now, and what she read made her want to immediately warn every delegate at the Peace Summit to be very careful about how they treated the human delegation. That Cronus had been apex predators on their own world. They had developed space travel and conquered 3 neighboring systems before they encountered humans, and they had looked at humanity and seen weak, soft mammals who relied on technology instead of natural weapons, who lacked armored hides or venomous claws or psionic abilities. The Cronus had attacked human colonies, expecting easy victories. They had been larger and stronger and more physically dangerous than humans in every measurable way, and then they had learned that physical superiority meant nothing against a species that refused to stop fighting no matter how many times you knocked them down. The war had lasted 3 years. The Cronus had won most of the major battles, had occupied several human worlds, had killed millions, but humans had kept coming back, kept adapting their tactics, kept refusing to surrender. Even when defeat seemed inevitable, human guerrilla fighters had made every occupied world a nightmare for Cronus forces. Humans had developed new weapons and strategies specifically designed to counter Cronus advantages, had hit supply lines and communication networks, had turned the war into a grinding campaign of attrition that the Cronus couldn't win because they had never evolved to fight enemies who simply would not quit in the end. The Cronus homeworld had surrendered unconditionally. Their warrior caste had been effectively destroyed. Their economy had collapsed. Their population had developed a cultural trauma that persisted decades later, and they had created a new word in their language that Shadow 17 moved through the ventilation system of harmonies, promise with the patient silence that had made the Shrell species the most feared assassins in known space. The metal walls around the assassin blurred slightly as the phase shift technology worked through carefully bred biology and surgical enhancements, keeping Shadow 17 displaced from normal spacetime by just enough to pass through solid matter like smoke through a screen. The contract had been simple and extremely lucrative. Eliminate Ambassador Chun during the peace summit and do it in a way that would destabilize the human coalition supporting the negotiations. The contractor had been a Krell military faction that wanted the war to continue for another decade because war was profitable and peace would require uncomfortable changes to their economy. Shadow 17 had never failed a mission in 17 years of operating. The Shrell ability to phase out of sync with normal matter made them effectively invisible and intangible, able to walk through walls and weapons as if neither existed, and this mission had seemed almost disappointingly easy based on the intelligence, provided the human delegation had minimal security. Just one guard who spent most of her time sleeping in a corner while Ambassador Chen conducted negotiations. Shadow 17 had observed for 3 days and confirmed the pattern before making the final decision to strike during today's crucial vote on territorial concessions. The assassin emerged from the ventilation grate in the upper level of the assembly hall. From this vantage point, Shadow 17 could see the entire room laid out below hundreds of delegates and their security forces, all focused on the heated debate currently raging between Krell and Vaxian representatives. Ambassador Chun sat in her delegation section. The young male assistant beside her took notes while she reviewed something on her datapad, and in the corner against the wall, Captain Reeves sat with her back straight, eyes closed, apparently sleeping through the shouting match that had half the room. On their feet, Perfect Shot 17 began the descent. Phased matter didn't interact with gravity the same way, so the assassin could control the fall somewhat, drifting down toward the main floor like a ghost made of smoke and shadows. None of the security forces in the room even glanced up because why would they look for threats that couldn't exist in normal space? The assassin touched down silently behind a group of Talaxian guards. Phased matter made no sound when it contacted solid surfaces because technically no contact occurred. Shadow 17 moved through the assembled beings like wind through grass. Invisible and untraceable, 20 meters from Ambassador Chun, 15 meters. 10 meters close enough now to see the human woman's profile as she frowned at whatever she was reading. Close enough to smell the strange scent that all humans carried, something organic and warm that marked them as carbon-based. Mammalian life. Shadow 17 began the slow process of solidifying. The molecular blade required enough physical presence to interact with normal matter, or it would simply pass through the target without causing damage. This was the most dangerous moment of any Shrell assassination, because for approximately 4 seconds the assassin would be partially visible and vulnerable, but every security guard in the room was watching the argument between the Krell and Vaxian delegations. The human guard was sleeping. No one would notice Shadow 17 until the blade had already stopped. Ambassador Chun's heart and the assassin had phased out again, dead and gone in under 10 seconds. 5 meters from the target. 3 meters. Molecular blade manifested in Shadow 17's hand as the phase shift reduced to 70%. Just enough to keep the Maya's assassin mostly invisible while allowing the weapon to exist in normal space. The blade was 30 centimeters of monomolecular edge that could slice through armor and bone without resistance. Shadow 17 positioned carefully. The blade needed to enter between the human's third and fourth rib on the left side, angled slightly upward to pierce the heart. One strike, instant death. No time for guards to react or medical teams to respond. 2 meters. The assassin began the strike. Muscles tensed to drive the blade forward in the killing thrust that would end Ambassador Chun and destabilize the entire process. And then a voice spoke in perfect Shrell language with an accent from the southern continental region that Shadow 17 had been born in over 4 decades ago. I can smell the ozone displacement when you phase. I've been tracking your movements since you entered through the ventilation shaft. You're currently 17 centimeters from Ambassador Chun's left shoulder. If you take one more step, I'll put a railgun spike through your primary cardiac ganglion. Shadow 17 froze. The voice had come from across the room, from the corner where the assassin turned slowly. Captain Reeves was standing now, but her eyes remained closed, and in her right hand she held a weapon that definitely had not been there 30 seconds ago. A compact railgun that looked custom-built and was aimed with impossible precision at a target that should be completely invisible. You can't possibly know where I am, Shadow 17 said. The words came out in a hiss of shock and disbelief, because this was impossible. No species could detect a phase Shrell. The technology and biology that made it work had been tested against every known sensor system in the galaxy. Your phase shift creates a pressure differential that changes air current patterns, Captain Reeves said calmly. Her voice never rose above conversational volume, but somehow Shadow 17 heard every word clearly. You displace approximately 0.07 cubic meters. The temperature drops by 0.3 degrees within 2 meters of your position. And you smell like sulfur hexafluoride, which is what your species excretes when under stress. The human still hadn't opened her eyes. She stood relaxed with the weapon aimed at a point in space where Shadow 17's primary cardiac ganglion was located. How could she possibly know Shrell anatomy well enough to target the one organ that would mean instant death if punctured? I've been following you for the past 47 seconds, Reeves continued. You entered through vent shaft 7 Alpha, descended along the western wall support beam, passed through the Talaxian security cordon at 14:30 local time, and approached from Ambassador Chun's left rear quarter. Would you like me to describe the pattern of your breathing, or shall we skip to the part where you leave? Shadow 17 felt something the assassin had not experienced in 17 Years of operations, this human had tracked every movement while appearing to be asleep, had identified species-specific biological markers that even advanced sensors struggled to detect, had drawn and aimed a weapon at a target she couldn't see with her eyes. And Shadow 17 suddenly understood that the sleeping guard had never been sleeping at all. How? The assassin whispered. How is this possible? I'm human, Reeves said simply. My species evolved hunting prey by following them for days without rest. We learned to track animals by the smallest signs because the ones who couldn't starved. We developed brains that process threat assessment constantly even during sleep because predators hunted us at night. You think you're invisible, but you're not. You're just another target leaving traces for me to follow. The railgun in her hand remained perfectly steady. Shadow 17 noticed that several other guards in the room had finally noticed something was happening, but none of them moved because they couldn't see what the human was aiming. And the assassin realized that even if every security force in the hall opened fire, they would miss because they had no idea where the target was. Only the sleeping human who wasn't sleeping had tracked the invisible assassin who wasn't as invisible as Shadow 17 had believed. You have 3 seconds to phase out and leave, Captain Reeves said. Her tone remained conversational, like she was discussing the weather instead of holding a trained killer at gunpoint. Or, I demonstrate why humanity earned our reputation during the Cronus incident. Shadow 17 knew about the Cronus incident. Every assassin and mercenary in the galaxy knew that story. The Cronus had believed themselves unbeatable, had attacked humanity expecting easy conquest, had learned over 3 brutal years that humans were the species you did not fight unless you were prepared to lose. Everything the Cronus warrior caste was extinct now. Their species survived, but they would never recover from the cultural and psychological damage of fighting humans to the end. And they had created a phrase in their language that translated to the horrible patience of Terra. Because humans didn't win through superior force or technology, they won by never giving up, never stopping, never accepting defeat no matter how many times you knocked them down. And Shadow 17 suddenly understood that Captain Reeves represented that same terrifying persistence. That she would chase the assassin across the station if necessary, would hunt through every corridor and ventilation shaft, would never stop until the threat was eliminated. I'm leaving, Shadow 17 said quietly. Good choice, Reeves replied. Tell your contractor the mission is void. Tell them what happened here. Make sure they understand that attempting to harm Ambassador Chun again would be a catastrophically bad idea. The assassin faced a full displacement. The molecular blade disappeared as Shadow 17 became completely non-corporeal again, and then the assassin moved as quickly as possible back toward the ventilation system because staying in the same room as that human suddenly felt like standing in the jaws of a trap that could snap closed at any moment. The Emergency Security Council convened in a sealed chamber 3 levels below the main assembly hall. Representatives from 24 different species gathered around a circular table designed to ensure no one held a position of dominance, and every single delegate looked troubled because word of what had happened with Shadow 17 had spread through intelligence channels faster than light speed. Communications could travel. General Kratok of the Krell military stood at his position. His armored plates shifted with agitation as he addressed the assembled security chiefs and intelligence analysts. We need to discuss the human problem before it becomes a crisis that threatens everyone present. There is no problem, Ambassador Triker said carefully. He had developed a healthy respect for humans over the past week. Ambassador Chun and her delegation have followed all protocols and caused no disruptions. A guard detected a phased Shrell assassin. A Vaxian security officer interrupted. Her crystalline form pulsed with concern. She tracked an invisible target through a crowded room while appearing to be unconscious. She threatened to shoot through the assassin's primary cardiac ganglion, which means she knows Shrell anatomy well enough to target their only immediately fatal weak point. The room fell silent. Several delegates exchanged worried glances. Because when you stripped away all the too diplomatic language, what remained was a simple and terrifying fact: humans had capabilities that made every other species' security measures look inadequate. By comparison, Shrek stood and activated a holographic display. Data streams and charts filled the air above the table as she began her presentation. I have compiled comprehensive intelligence on human military capabilities and evolutionary history. What I found should concern all of us. She brought up footage from Earth showing humans engaged in what they called endurance running. The images showed individuals moving at a steady pace for hours without stopping, covering distances that would hospitalize most species. Humans evolved as persistent predators, Shrek explained. They chase prey until the target collapsed from heat exhaustion. This hunting method required tracking skills, endurance, and the psychological ability to maintain focus over extremely long periods. A Talaxian delegate made a dismissive gesture. Many species were hunters. We evolved past such primitive survival strategies when we developed technology and civilization. Humans did not, Shrek said flatly. They retained every single adaptation from their predator past. The tracking skills, the endurance, the relentless focus, and then they built civilization on top of those instincts without losing them. She changed the display to show battles from human history. The images were brutal and disturbing: masses of humans fighting with primitive weapons, warriors charging into certain death, sieges that lasted for years. Human warfare is fundamentally different from galactic norms, Shrek continued. We fight over territory and resources with clear objectives. Humans fight total wars where entire populations become combatants. We surrender when defeat becomes inevitable. Humans have a concept called last stand, where they continue fighting even after victory is impossible. More images appeared. Ancient fortifications where small groups of humans had held against overwhelming numbers. Recent conflicts where human soldiers had refused evacuation from hopeless positions. Medals and awards given specifically for dying rather than retreating. This is their history, Shrek said. Thousands of years of celebrating defeats where they inflicted maximum damage before falling. Entire military doctrines built around the idea that death is preferable to surrender. Songs and stories that glorify last stands and hopeless battles. A crow general named Greshter stood. His mandibles clicked with irritation. History is history. One soldier cannot stand against armies, no matter how skilled or how stubborn. That is where you are wrong, an elderly Talaxian diplomat said quietly. His name was Venther, and he had spent 40 years studying Earth cultures. May I? Shrek stepped aside. Venther moved to the display and brought up his own files. 300 Spartans held a mountain pass called Thermopylae against a Persian army of perhaps 100,000 for 3 days. He began. They all died, but they bought time for their civilization to prepare defenses. He changed the image. 37 defenders held a missionary station called Rock's Drift against 4,000 Zulu warriors for 12 hours. They survived, but by any logical calculation, they should have been overwhelmed in minutes. Another image. 189 Texans held a fortification called the Alamo against several thousand Mexican soldiers for 13 days. They died to the last man, but again, they delayed an army and became legendary in the process. Venther looked around the table. These are not legends or myths. These are historical records from different human cultures across different time periods. The pattern is consistent. When humans decide something must be held or someone must be protected, they do not calculate odds or consider logical withdrawal. They simply refuse to quit until they physically cannot continue. He paused. And what terrifies me is that these stories are not warnings in human culture. They are inspiration. Human children learn about these defeats as examples of heroism. Human soldiers study these battles as tactical lessons. Refusing to surrender, even when death is certain, is considered the highest form of military honor. General Greshthur's mandibles stopped clicking. Around the table, other delegates had gone very quiet as they processed the implications. The Cronus learned this. Venther continued. They were apex predators, larger and stronger than humans in every measurable way. They attacked human colonies expecting easy conquest. And then they spent 3 years discovering that physical superiority means nothing against a species that refuses to accept defeat. Shrek brought up files from the Cronus conflict. Casualty reports, battle analyses, psychological studies. The Cronus won most major battles, she said. They occupied multiple human worlds. They killed millions, but humans kept coming back. They adapted tactics, developed new weapons, turned every occupied world into a nightmare of guerrilla warfare and sabotage. The images showed Cronus soldiers looking exhausted and traumatized. The Cronus warrior caste developed what their psychologists called terra fatigue, a condition where soldiers became afraid to patrol, afraid to sleep, afraid because they never knew when humans would strike next. The humans were always there, always adapting, always refusing to quit. In the end, the Cronus homeworld surrendered unconditionally, Venther said. Not because humans had superior numbers or technology, but because the Cronus population simply could not endure fighting an enemy that would not stop. Their warrior caste went extinct, their economy collapsed, and they created a new phrase in their language, the horrible patience of Terra, because humans had demonstrated something that no other species fully understood. He looked directly at General Greshthur. You said one soldier cannot stand against armies. I say that one human soldier is an army unto herself if she decides the battle is worth fighting. Captain Reeves, sleeping in that corner, is more dangerous than your entire security detail because she has been trained to never stop, never quit, never surrender, and she is protecting Ambassador Chun with the full weight of human military philosophy backing her up. So what do we do? A nervous Vaxian delegate asked. How do we protect our own ambassadors if humans have such capabilities? Triker stood. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent the week thinking carefully about exactly this question. We ensure the peace talks succeed, he said simply, because the alternative is discovering what happens when humanity decides peaceful. Negotiation is not working. Around the table, delegates nodded slowly. Several looked physically ill as they contemplated fighting a species that had evolved to hunt prey over days without rest, that had built civilization without losing predator instincts, that measured military success by how much damage they inflicted before falling rather than by survival. I recommend we increase security for all delegations, Shrek said. Not because we fear human attack, but because we need to ensure no other factions attempt disruptions. The presence of Captain Reeves has made one thing very clear: humanity wants this peace summit to succeed, and anyone who threatens that success will face consequences. The vote was unanimous. Security details doubled overnight, while intelligence services worked to spread the word through back channels. Do not test the sleeping human. Do not threaten Ambassador Chun. Do not assume that minimal security means inadequate protection, because the deadliest thing in that assembly hall was not the heavily armed Krull warriors or the psionic Vaxian guards or the cybernetically enhanced Talaxian enforcers. It was the small human woman who sat in the corner with her eyes closed, tracking every threat while appearing to sleep. representing a species that had spent millions of years learning to be patient hunters, and then had never forgotten that lesson even after reaching the stars. The emergency council adjourned. Delegates returned to their quarters, with new appreciation for why Ambassador Chun seemed so unconcerned about security and new determination to ensure the peace negotiations succeeded, because none of them wanted to learn what humanity looked like when diplomacy failed and the sleeping predators woke up fully. The final day of the peace summit arrived with tension that seemed to charge the air throughout Harmony's Promise. 3 weeks of negotiations had brought the Krell Empire and Vaxian Collective to the edge of a historic agreement. But everyone knew this last session was when opposition forces would make their final, desperate attempts to derail the process. Ambassador Chun stood before the full assembly. She wore the same simple black suit she had worn every day, but somehow today it seemed more significant, more formal. Behind her, Captain Reeves sat in her usual corner, positioned with eyes closed and breathing steady. And now every security officer in the room watched her with new understanding and barely concealed nervousness. Esteemed delegates, Chun began. Her voice carried clearly through the vast hall. I know you have been discussing my security detail. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. Trico noticed that most of the assembly looked embarrassed at having their private security councils exposed, but Ambassador Chen simply smiled that dangerous smile that never quite reached her eyes. I know you have learned about Captain Reeves, Chen continued. About the Cronus incident, about human military history, about our evolution as persistence predators who never learn to stop hunting. I know you are afraid. She paused. The silence in the hall was absolute. Good, Chan said softly. You should be afraid, not because we want to terrorize you, but because fear leads to respect, and respect leads to careful thought before action. Captain Reeves is a weapon, yes, one of the most effective weapons humanity has ever created. But she is also a promise. Chun walked to the center of the speaking floor. Every eye followed her. A promise that I will leave this station safely, she said. A promise that this peace accord will be signed. A promise that humanity will enforce that peace if necessary through whatever means prove required. Captain Reeves represents what my species becomes when we decide something matters enough to protect. A Krell delegate stood. And if we refuse? If this peace fails and war continues? Ambassador Chun's expression hardened. Then Captain Reeves will stop sleeping, and I promise you, esteemed delegates, you do not want to see what humanity looks like when we stop resting and start hunting in earnest. She gestured toward the captain. For 3 weeks you have watched her sit in that corner with her eyes closed. You thought she was sleeping, that we were unprepared or foolish or weak, but the entire time she's been cataloging every person in this room, assessing threat levels, planning response scenarios, maintaining constant tactical awareness while appearing vulnerable. Chun's voice grew stronger. That is what it means to be human. We rest, but we never truly lower our guard. Evolution made us this way over millions of years of being both predator and prey. We learned that survival means staying alert even when you appear defenseless, that the difference between life and death is maintaining readiness even when others think you are weak. Triker stood. You speak of Captain Reeves as if she is unique, but surely not all humans possess such capabilities. No, Chun admitted. Not all humans are elite soldiers trained to track invisible assassins. But I would ask you to consider this. What makes you think Captain Reeves is the only human on this station who could protect me if necessary? The question hung in the air. Several delegates looked confused until Shrek stood with her crystalline form pulsing in alarm. The civilian humans, she said quietly. The merchant crews, the scientists, the support staff, you are saying they are all potential threats? Ambassador Chun smiled again. I am saying that every human carries the same evolutionary heritage. We are all descended from persistent predators. We all have brains wired for threat assessment and pattern recognition. We all grew up in cultures that celebrate the concept of protecting what matters no matter the personal cost. She let that sink in. Captain Reeves is a professional who has honed natural abilities to an extreme level, but in an emergency, any human on this station would move to intercept a threat against their ambassador. Because that is what we do. We protect our own. We refuse to let our people fall without fighting back. We carry forward the legacy of countless generations who survived by never giving up. Venther, the elderly Talaxian diplomat, stood and inclined his head respectfully. You came to these negotiations with minimal security, not because you lacked protection, but because you had more than enough. Is that what you are telling us, Ambassador? I am telling you that humanity sent exactly the force we believed necessary, Chun replied. One professional soldier to send a clear message and enough civilian presence to ensure no one would be foolish enough to test that message, and I am telling you that this peace accord will be signed today because every species in this room understands that the alternative is discovering what happens when humans decide. Diplomatic solutions have failed. The vote was called. The peace accord passed with unanimous support. Every delegation signed the treaty that would end 5 years of brutal warfare and establish frameworks for lasting peace, and through it all Captain Reeves remained in her corner with eyes closed, still appearing to sleep, still tracking every movement in the room as delegates began to file out after the ceremony. Stryker approached Ambassador Chun one final time. I must know, he said quietly. Was she really sleeping all those times? Chun considered the question. Captain Reeves has a saying that perhaps explains humanity better than any speech I could give, she replied. She says that sleep is just another form of readiness. The predators do not stop hunting just because their eyes are closed. They are simply waiting for prey to think they are safe. She leaned closer. In that room during every session, Captain Reeves was the deadliest thing present. Not because of her weapons or training, but because she never stopped being ready. She slept, yes, but she never stopped hunting. That is what it means to be human. We rest, but we never truly lower our guard, because evolution taught us that the moment you feel completely safe is the moment you die. Stryker clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. And the other humans on the station? Oh, they are exactly what they appear to be, Chun said. Scientists pursuing research, merchants conducting trade, technicians maintaining equipment. But if someone had attacked this summit, if assassins had gotten past Captain Reeves somehow, those civilians would have transformed into soldiers, because every human is a soldier who just has not been activated yet. She smiled. We are a species that awards medals for dying rather than surrendering. That celebrates last stands and hopeless battles. That refuses to accept defeat, even when victory is impossible, Captain. Reeves is simply the most obvious expression of what we all carry inside. The human delegation departed. Their ship left the Harmony's Promise on schedule, and intelligence analysts across the galaxy immediately began reviewing security footage from the past 3 weeks because Ambassador Chen's final words had raised disturbing questions about exactly how many humans had been on the station and what they had been doing. What they found sent chills through every analyst who saw it. During the moment when Shadow 17 had manifested the molecular blade near Ambassador Chun, 17 other humans throughout the station had responded in the same. Second, a merchant ship captain had altered course to return to dock. A maintenance technician had dropped tools and started moving toward the assembly hall. 3 human scientists in different laboratories had stopped their work and turned toward the diplomatic sector. 2 human traders in the market district had abandoned their stalls. Even a human janitor working 3 levels below the assembly hall had begun moving toward the nearest emergency access shaft. All of them had responded in the instant when Captain Reeves confronted the assassin. All of them had been moving toward the threat before most species had even processed that something was wrong. The security footage analysis generated a new protocol across Galactic Council systems. It was designated Human Detection Threshold, and it acknowledged something that made military planners very nervous when humans were present. You could not count the soldiers by their uniforms, because any human might be a threat waiting to activate. The report noted that humanity's evolutionary history as both predator and prey had created a species with threat response systems that never fully deactivated, with pattern recognition abilities that constantly scan for danger, with a cultural heritage that taught every individual to protect their community, no matter the personal cost. Captain Reeves had been the visible deterrent, the obvious weapon that everyone could see and fear. But she had never been alone, because humanity did not send lone warriors to important missions. They sent communities that looked harmless until the moment they needed to become dangerous. The peace held through the following months. The Krell Empire and Vaxian Collective honored the treaty terms because both sides understood that breaking the accord would bring human attention, and no one wanted to discover what happened when humanity's diplomatic representatives went home and were replaced by their military. Forster Core kept a copy of the security footage on his personal device. Sometimes late at night, he would watch those 17 humans moving in perfect synchronization toward a threat they could not have known about through any normal channels, and he would remember Ambassador Chun's words about sleep being just another form of readiness.